For 36 years, from 1787 to 1823, affluent families all throughout colonial America made a similar decision. They dispatched their difficult sons, the ones who asked too many questions or knew too many secrets, to a place called St. Augustine Seminary in Virginia. It was advertised as an institution for religious education and spiritual realignment. Yet, despite hundreds of young men being enrolled, not a single one of them ever came back home. Official church documents confirm that 247 students were registered during those decades, but the records show 0 graduates ever being ordained as priests. The fate of these young men became a silent, lingering question for generations, a mystery with no answer. That is, until 1998, when a team of renovation workers, while updating an old Virginian estate, uncovered a hidden cache of documents. These papers revealed the terrifying truth. The seminary was never a place of learning. It was, in fact, an intricately designed prison and a sophisticated extortion scheme, all cleverly disguised behind the respected facade of religious instruction. You will find that very few channels are willing to speak about this case, because the influence of the Sterling family, even today, extends much further into the fabric of society than most people would ever suspect. Before we delve deeper into the story of Father Edmund Sterling and his unholy institution, make sure you are subscribed to this channel and that you have activated the notification bell. The history we are about to uncover is not for the faint of heart. It is strictly for genuine investigators of the past's darkest secrets. And as we begin, we want you to tell us in the comments section below, from which state are you listening to this tale? The Sterling family had always operated with a core understanding that knowledge, particularly the wrong kind of knowledge, was the most dangerous inheritance one could possess. Colonial Virginia in 1787 was a world of sprawling plantations, rapidly expanding tobacco fortunes, and powerful families whose wealth was often built upon secrets they needed to keep buried. The Tidewater region, with its complex web of rivers and secluded estates, offered the perfect landscape for those who preferred their business to remain unseen. It was here, in Henrico County, that the Sterling family had carefully established themselves as respected figures in both commerce and the community of faith. Edmund Sterling, born in 1751, was the third son of a highly successful tobacco merchant. A man who had built his fortune using methods that the polite circles of the time deliberately chose to ignore. While his older brothers were given control of the family's legitimate public businesses, Edmund was bequeathed something far more valuable, a profound understanding of the darkest aspects of human nature, and a unique talent for exploiting those weaknesses with ruthless precision. When he declared his plan to build a Catholic seminary in a predominantly Protestant part of Virginia, his family initially saw it as an eccentric, almost embarrassing burst of religious passion. They could never have imagined it would become the cornerstone of the most profitable and sinister criminal enterprise. In colonial America, St. Augustine Seminary was constructed in 1786 on a vast tract of 340 acres of thick, secluded woodland. Its location was strategically chosen, distant enough from Richmond to guarantee privacy, yet sufficiently accessible for wealthy parents to make visits to their sons. The Gothic-style stone buildings, the imported craftsmen, and the authentically extensive library all contributed to an aura of legitimate scholarly pursuit. Edmund Sterling, who had briefly attended the College of William and Mary before professing a divine calling, now adopted the title of Father Sterling. He assembled a small team of associates, men whose past professional backgrounds were as dubious as their present loyalty to him. The seminary's distinctive reputation spread rapidly through the interconnected networks of Virginia's upper class. Here was a Catholic institution managed by a man of seemingly flawless breeding, which offered to take in and educate young men who had become problematic for their powerful families. These were sons who had inquired too deeply into business affairs, who had witnessed events they were not supposed to see, or who possessed information that had the potential to ruin entire family legacies. The seminary promised not merely an education, but absolute discretion, complete isolation, and, most importantly, a total transformation of character. What these families could not know was that Father Sterling had no interest whatsoever in teaching their sons theology. His true objective was to educate himself about their family's most guarded secrets, their business dealings, and, most critically, to discover exactly how much they would be willing to pay to ensure that certain information remained buried forever. The first group of students arrived in the spring of 1787. They were 12 young men, aged between 16 and 23, sent by families whose names were prominent on shipping documents, land ownership records, and government contracts throughout Virginia and the Carolinas. Each family paid a significant enrollment fee of £50 sterling, a sum substantial enough to construct a small house, and they committed to making further contributions for their sons' ongoing spiritual development. They believed they were investing in discretion and redemption. In reality, they were unknowingly financing their own eventual ruin by the autumn of 1789. The first subtle indications that something was deeply wrong at St. Augustine's Seminary began to surface, though it would take many years for anyone to fully comprehend the scale of Father Sterling's operation. Jonathan Whitmore, the oldest son of a wealthy shipping magnate from Charleston, had been enrolled at the seminary after he uncovered irregularities in his father's cargo manifests, discrepancies that hinted the family business involved more than just tobacco and rice. When the month of October passed without the usual letter from their son, the Whitmore family sent their most trusted overseer, a man named Thomas Hartwell, to check on Jonathan's progress. What Hartwell encountered at St. Augustine defied easy explanation. On the surface, the seminary appeared to be operating normally. He could hear the sounds of evening prayers coming from the chapel. He could see lights burning in the study hall windows, and he observed the daily routines one would expect from a religious institution. But when he specifically asked to see Jonathan, Father Sterling's response was strange. He explained that the young man was engaged in a deep spiritual retreat, having undergone a powerful religious awakening that required total isolation from worldly matters, including all correspondence with his family. Hartwell, a man with 3 decades of experience managing the Whitmore family's most sensitive affairs, immediately recognized when he was being given an evasive answer. He insisted on at least catching a glimpse of Jonathan during evening prayers, just to provide the family with peace of mind regarding his well-being. Father Sterling agreed, but attached a peculiar condition. Hartwell had to observe from the back of the chapel. hidden in the shadows, and he was forbidden from attempting to make any contact. That evening, as twilight settled around the stone walls of St. Augustine, Hartwell positioned himself in a rear alcove of the chapel. What he witnessed there would haunt him for the rest of his life, though he would never fully grasp what he had actually seen. The young men who filed into the pews for evening prayers moved with an unnatural, synchronized uniformity. Their faces bore expressions of serene compliance that seemed almost vacant. They recited the liturgy in perfect unison, never looking toward the visitors section, never displaying the slightest restlessness or individual personality. One would anticipate from a group of confined young men, most disturbing of all. When Hartwell discreetly counted the participants, he could only identify 19 figures in the pews. Despite Father Sterling's claim of having 37 students currently enrolled, among those 19 faces, illuminated by the dim candlelight, Hartwell believed he recognized Jonathan Whitmore. But the vibrant, rebellious heir who had left Charleston now sat with the glassy-eyed devotion of a man who seemed to have forgotten his own identity. When Hartwell returned to Charleston and reported his observations to the Whitmore family, they were faced with an impossible dilemma. Their son appeared to be alive and physically well, receiving the spiritual guidance they had requested. Yet something fundamental within him had clearly been altered, and to demand his immediate return might raise uncomfortable questions about why he had been sent away in the first place. The Whitmores, as Father Sterling had calculated they would, chose silence. They continued their payments to St. Augustine Seminary, telling themselves and their acquaintances that Jonathan had discovered his true calling in religious life. This was easier than confronting the terrifying alternative, that they had delivered their firstborn son into the grasp of something far more monstrous than the scandal they had sought to avoid in the months that followed. Similar unsettling scenarios quietly unfolded among other powerful Virginia families. Sons who had been sent to St. Augustine for correction were indeed sending letters home, but the correspondence was strangely uniform, filled with expressions of devotion and contentment that felt scripted. Parents who visited found their children changed in ways that were difficult to articulate, more obedient, less inquisitive, and eerily placid about their circumstances. None of these families communicated their concerns to one another. The very reasons their sons had been sent to St. Augustine in the first place guaranteed that silence was a far safer option than investigation. And Father Sterling relied on that collective silence as deliberately as he tallied the ever-increasing fees he demanded for their sons. Continued spiritual development. As the 1790s continued, St. Augustine Seminary's reputation grew within elite circles, but always in hushed conversations and carefully worded recommendations. The institution had become a unique fixture in colonial society, a place where troublesome sons could be sent without the public shame of a scandal or the finality of disinheritance. The families who utilized Father Sterling's services found themselves entangled in a web of mutual complicity. Each had sent a son to St. Augustine for reasons they could never publicly admit, creating a network of shared secrets that bound them all to silence. The Randolph family had enrolled their youngest son after he found evidence of his uncle's involvement in slave trading, a practice that violated both Virginia law and the family's public reputation. The Carters sent their heir apparent after he started asking pointed questions. about tenant farmers who had mysteriously disappeared from their Rappahannock River plantations. The Byrds delivered their son after he witnessed a late-night meeting that connected his father to a series of convenient deaths among business competitors. What none of these families realized was that Father Sterling was systematically recording every secret, every scandal, every piece of damning information that had necessitated their son's enrollment. His private office, located in the seminary's tower, contained meticulously organized files on each family's vulnerabilities. These files included names, dates, locations, and witness testimonies that had been willingly provided by their own children during what they believed were confidential spiritual counseling sessions. The gradual transformation process the students underwent at St. Augustine was carefully managed and orchestrated. New arrivals were initially housed in comfortable rooms and treated with apparent respect. They attended genuine theology classes taught by Father Sterling, who was, despite his questionable credentials, surprisingly knowledgeable. The food was of high quality, the library was well stocked, and the daily schedule was structured but not overly harsh. However, within just a few weeks of their arrival, subtle changes began to manifest. Students would mention in their letters home that they felt unusually tired, blaming it on the demanding spiritual routine. Their handwriting would slowly become more uniform and controlled. Their letters grew progressively shorter and more formulaic, expressing gratitude for their family's wisdom in sending them to such a beneficial place. Unbeknownst to the students, their evening wine was being laced with carefully measured doses of laudanum and other opiates, substances readily available to someone with the right medical connections. The dosages were precise enough to create dependency and docility, without producing obvious physical signs of drug abuse. Combined with their complete isolation from the outside world and the constant psychological reinforcement of their family's disappointment in their past behavior, this chemical influence created young men who were increasingly compliant and decreasingly capable of independent thought. By 1793, Father Sterling had perfected his system to such a degree that he could predict almost exactly how long it would take to break a new arrival's resistance and rebuild him into the placid figure his family would expect to see during rare visits. This process typically took between 4 and 8 months, varying with the student's initial personality and the severity of the secrets he carried. But Sterling's true genius lay not in controlling the students, but in manipulating their families. As months stretched into years, the fees for continued enrollment began to climb steadily. What had begun as an annual tuition of £50, Sterling gradually escalated to hundreds, then thousands of pounds, always justified by expanded spiritual programs and advanced theological studies. Families found themselves paying not for their son's education, but for the continued silence regarding the family secrets that had been extracted from their sons during those early counseling sessions. When parents protested the rising costs, Father Sterling would gently remind them of conversations their children had shared during spiritual direction, conversations about business practices, family history, or witnessed events that could destroy reputations and fortunes if they ever became public knowledge. The choice was always presented delicately, but with absolute clarity: continue supporting their son's spiritual journey, or risk having their family's darkest secrets exposed to all of Virginia society. Almost without exception, the families paid by the winter of 1798. 11 years after the founding of St. Augustine's Seminary, Father Sterling's operation had evolved into something far more sophisticated than simple extortion. He had created what he privately referred to as the Virginia Arrangement, a complex network of interconnected blackmail schemes that effectively controlled nearly 24 of the colony's most influential families. The system operated with clockwork precision. Students who had been at the seminary for several years were gradually moved from the main dormitories to private living quarters in the basement levels, supposedly for advanced contemplative studies. These basement rooms, carved from the natural limestone beneath the building, were furnished comfortably enough to avoid obvious signs of imprisonment, but they were secured in ways that made escape impossible. The students held in these lower levels rarely appeared at public prayers anymore, as their spiritual advancement was said to have progressed beyond the need for communal worship. Meanwhile, new students continued to arrive at a regular pace, maintaining the seminary's facade of an active institution while providing fresh sources of family, intelligence, and additional revenue. Father Sterling had become an expert at identifying which young men possessed the most dangerous knowledge about their family's affairs, and these particular individuals found their spiritual retreats becoming increasingly permanent. The case of Charles Randolph, enrolled in 1796, illustrates Sterling's evolving methods with chilling clarity. Charles had been sent to St. Augustine after discovering that his father's tobacco export business was being used to launder profits from illegal slave trading operations, a practice that violated both Virginia law and federal maritime statutes. Initially, Charles's letters home expressed the expected complaints about strict discipline and homesickness. But as the months passed, his correspondence became increasingly supportive of his family's business practices, even including explicit approval of the very trading arrangements he had previously condemned. When Thomas Jefferson Randolph, Charles's younger brother, visited the seminary in early 1799, he found Charles transformed into an articulate defender of the family's commercial interests. Charles spoke knowledgeably about crop rotations, shipping schedules, and labor management techniques that would maximize profit while minimizing legal risks. His previous moral objections to the family's slave trading connections had apparently been resolved through intensive theological study of biblical passages concerning slavery. But Thomas Jefferson Randolph was more perceptive than most visitors. He noticed that his brother's pupils were consistently dilated despite the bright daylight in the visiting room. He observed a slight tremor in Charles's hands when he was not actively engaged in conversation. Most tellingly, when Thomas mentioned the name of a childhood dog they had both adored for 7 years, Charles showed no flicker of recognition. These observations might have remained a private family matter, but Thomas Jefferson Randolph made a decision that would ultimately begin the unraveling of Father Sterling's entire operation. Instead of confronting his family directly about his brother's condition, he launched his own private investigation into the practices and history of St. Augustine's Seminary. Thomas was uniquely positioned for such an inquiry. As a junior partner in the family shipping business, he had access to commercial records, correspondence networks, and business contacts throughout Virginia and the Carolinas. More importantly, he had inherited his grandfather's habit of meticulous record-keeping and his father's suspicious nature regarding financial arrangements that seemed too convenient to be legitimate. Over the following months, Thomas traced the financial relationships between St. Augustine Seminary and nearly 24 prominent families. He discovered that tuition payments had escalated far beyond any reasonable educational cost, and that many families were making additional, sizable donations for specialized services that were never clearly defined. He located shipping records indicating that supplies delivered to the seminary included unusual quantities of medical equipment, pharmaceutical ingredients, and construction materials more suited to building a prison than an educational facility. Most significantly, Thomas began tracking the students who had supposedly graduated or left St. Augustine over its 11-year history. What he discovered was profoundly disturbing. While 247 young men had been enrolled, fewer than 24 had ever been documented as returning to their families or building careers elsewhere. The overwhelming majority seemed to have simply vanished from all public records after their enrollment. It was at this moment that Thomas Jefferson Randolph realized his brother, Charles, might not be the victim of unconventional religious indoctrination, but of something far more sinister. Thomas Jefferson Randolph's investigation took a dangerous turn in the spring of 1799 when he discovered he was not the only one asking questions about St. Augustine's Seminary. Through his shipping contacts, he learned that several other families had privately commissioned discreet inquiries into the institution, all reporting similar concerns about their sons' transformations and the seminary's constantly growing financial demands. But these families were discovering what Thomas had already suspected, that investigating Father Sterling meant risking exposure of the very secrets that had compelled them to send their sons away in the first place. Every inquiry into the seminary's practices opened doors that most families desperately wanted to keep locked forever. The breakthrough came when Thomas connected with Martha Henley, the widow of a Williamsburg physician who had died under suspicious circumstances in 1797. Dr. Henley had been one of the few medical professionals willing to treat patients discreetly, never asking questions about unusual injuries or conditions that wealthy families wished to keep private. His patient records, which Martha had inherited along with substantial debts, included several entries for consultations at St. Augustine Seminary. According to Dr. Henley's notes, Father Sterling had sought medical advice concerning the long-term administration of opiates to young men, specifically asking about dosages that would create dependency without causing obvious physical deterioration. The doctor's records showed multiple visits to the seminary between 1794 and 1796, during which he had examined students showing signs of chronic drug use. Though they were presented as suffering from spiritual melancholia or religious ecstasy, more disturbing were Dr. Henley's final entries about St. Augustine, dated just weeks before his sudden death officially ruled a heart attack. The physician had begun expressing deep concerns about the ethical implications of his consultations with Father Sterling, noting that several students he examined appeared to be suffering from more than just spiritual distress. His last entry on the seminary was a single, damning line: "The Sterling arrangement represents a fundamental violation of both medical ethics and human dignity. When Thomas Jefferson Randolph shared Dr. Henley's records with Martha, she revealed that her husband had been planning to report his concerns about St. Augustine to the colonial authorities before his unexpected death. She had long suspected his demise was connected to his growing moral objections regarding his work for Father Sterling, but she had lacked both the evidence and the social standing to pursue an investigation alone. Together, Thomas and Martha began formulating a strategy to expose the true nature of St. Augustine's Seminary, but they were operating under severe constraints. Any public revelation would destroy the families whose sons were imprisoned there, including Thomas's own. They needed to find a way to rescue the students without exposing the secrets that had led to their imprisonment. Their solution was both elegant and extremely dangerous. Thomas would use his shipping business to orchestrate an accidental discovery of the seminary's illegal activities by colonial authorities, while Martha would ensure that medical evidence of the students' condition would be available to support legal action against Father Sterling. But as they finalized their plans, they made a chilling discovery that altered everything they thought they knew about St. Augustine Seminary. While conducting a final review of Dr. Henley's patient files, Martha discovered a hidden compartment in her husband's medical bag containing documents that revealed the ultimate scope of Father Sterling's operation. The seminary was not merely imprisoning inconvenient sons and extorting their families. It was systematically eliminating students who proved to resistant to chemical control or who retained too much dangerous knowledge about their families' secrets. The documents included detailed anatomical drawings and medical notes describing what Dr. Henley had termed staged accidents methods designed to eliminate specific students while maintaining plausible deniability. The physician had apparently been coerced into providing medical expertise for murders disguised as accidental deaths, suicides, or natural causes related to the students' supposed spiritual afflictions. Among these documents was a list of named students who had been eliminated over the seminary's 11-year history. This list contained 23 names, which matched exactly the number of death certificates that had been officially issued for St. Augustine students. But more terrifying was a second list, labeled Pending Resolution, which included 12 names of current students, among them Charles Randolph. Thomas Jefferson Randolph realized with horror that his brother was not just imprisoned at St. Augustine's Seminary. He was scheduled for execution. Just when we think we have heard the worst of it, the horror hidden within Virginia's hills grows even darker. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who appreciates a deep historical mystery. Hit the like button to help support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Let's discover together what happens next in this disturbing tale of human greed and corruption. The desperate race to save Charles Randolph and the other condemned students had now begun. But Thomas and Martha were about to learn that Father Sterling had been anticipating their investigation all along. On the night of May 17, 1799, Thomas Jefferson Randolph and Martha Henley approached St. Augustine Seminary with a perilous plan to rescue the imprisoned students before Father Sterling could carry out his final solution. What they discovered in the limestone chambers beneath the seminary would haunt the survivors for the remainder of their lives, and reveal the full, horrifying scope of one of colonial America's most systematic criminal enterprises. The basement levels of St. Augustine contained not just holding cells for current students, but a fully equipped medical facility where Dr. Henley had been forced to participate in what Father Sterling termed spiritual interventions. The pharmaceutical supplies Thomas had traced through shipping records were being used not only to control living students, but also to stage convincing deaths for those who could no longer be safely maintained. Charles Randolph was found in the final stage of Father Sterling's elimination process, heavily sedated with opiates and showing clear signs of systematic poisoning designed to mimic the symptoms of consumption. According to the medical charts Martha discovered, he was scheduled to die from respiratory failure within the week, with his death to be reported to his family as the tragic outcome of spiritual exhaustion combined with a naturally weak constitution. But Charles was not the most horrifying discovery in the seminary's underground chambers. In a section of the basement that served as Father Sterling's private study, Thomas and Martha found detailed records of the entire Virginia arrangement, spanning 12 years of operation. The files contained not just information on current students and their families, but comprehensive documentation of Father Sterling's systematic expansion throughout colonial society. The operation had grown far beyond the simple extortion of wealthy families. Father Sterling had used the intelligence gathered from imprisoned students to manipulate business deals, political appointments, and legal proceedings throughout Virginia and neighboring colonies. He had documentation of slave trading violations, tax evasion schemes, fraudulent land deals, and political corruption involving dozens of prominent families, judges, and colonial officials. More chilling was the discovery that Father Sterling had been selling some of this intelligence to British agents operating in the colonies, effectively transforming St. Augustine's Seminary into a center for espionage against American commercial and political interests. The fees paid by families for their sons' education had been supplemented by substantial payments from British intelligence services seeking compromising information on colonial leadership. But the most devastating revelation was contained in Father Sterling's personal correspondence with his British contacts. These letters revealed that the entire seminary operation was designed not merely for profit, but as part of a systematic British effort to destabilize colonial society by compromising and controlling its most influential families. The British had been secretly funding St. Augustine's Seminary as part of their strategy to maintain influence over American commerce and politics. Even as colonial independence movements were gaining strength, the students imprisoned in the basement were not just victims of individual family scandals. They were casualties in a larger, covert conflict between imperial powers, sacrificed to maintain British intelligence advantages. When Thomas and Martha attempted to evacuate the surviving students, they discovered that Father Sterling had been prepared for this exact scenario. The seminary's staff, who had appeared to be simple religious instructors, were in fact armed guards with military training. The building itself had been designed as a fortress, with multiple layers of security and weapons concealed throughout the facility. The confrontation that followed revealed Father Sterling's true nature. He was neither a religious fanatic nor a simple criminal. but a sophisticated intelligence operative who had used religious authority and family desperation to create one of the most effective espionage networks in colonial America. "You must understand," Father Sterling told Thomas as armed men surrounded the rescue party, "that exposing this operation means destroying every family whose secrets we have documented. Your own family's slave trading violations alone would lead to criminal prosecution, financial ruin, and a social disgrace that would follow your descendants for generations." He gestured toward the files containing evidence of the Randolph family's illegal activities. "Your brother, Charles, possesses detailed knowledge of shipping manifests, financial arrangements, and business relationships that could destroy not just your family, but dozens of others throughout Virginia's commercial network. His continued existence represents unacceptable risk to operations that benefit the Crown's interests in maintaining colonial stability." Thomas realized then that Father Sterling was not just threatening individual families. He was threatening to expose an entire network of corruption that would destabilize Virginia's social and economic structure. The choice was not between saving his brother and protecting his family's reputation. It was between preserving colonial society's facade of legitimacy and revealing the systematic corruption that made that society function. "The choice is simple," Sterling continued. "Allow us to complete our arrangements with the students currently in residence, and their families' secrets remain protected. Attempt to interfere with our operation, and we will release documentation that will destroy the reputation and financial stability of every prominent family in Virginia." But Thomas Jefferson Randolph had spent months preparing for this exact moment, and he had not come to St. Augustine Seminary alone. The resolution of the St. Augustine Seminary crisis demanded sacrifices that would reshape Virginia's political and social landscape for decades. Thomas Jefferson Randolph's investigation had led him to a conclusion Father Sterling never anticipated: that the only way to destroy the seminary's operation was to expose the very corruption it was designed to exploit and protect. With Martha Henley and a small group of colonial officials who had discovered their own families were being compromised by Sterling's intelligence network, Thomas had developed a strategy that would sacrifice their social standing to save their children and dismantle British intelligence operations in Virginia. On the morning of May 18, 1799, coordinated raids by colonial militia units seized St. Augustine Seminary and arrested Father Sterling along with his staff of British agents. Simultaneously, Thomas Jefferson Randolph and 17 other prominent Virginia families publicly confessed to the illegal business practices, political corruption, and social violations that had made them vulnerable to Sterling's operation. The public revelations were devastating to Virginia's social order. Families that had dominated colonial commerce and politics for generations faced criminal prosecution, financial collapse, and social ostracism. The Randolph family's confession regarding their slave trading violations sparked the largest criminal investigation in Virginia's colonial history, ultimately exposing systematic legal violations by dozens of powerful families. But the drastic strategy worked. By voluntarily exposing their own secrets, the families removed Father Sterling's primary leverage over them and neutralized the British intelligence advantage the seminary had provided. The confessions were carefully coordinated to reveal criminal activities while protecting information that could compromise colonial military or political interests in the growing tensions with Britain. Charles Randolph and 18 other students were rescued from the seminary's basement chambers. Though their physical and psychological recovery would take years, the medical treatments they had endured left several with permanent neurological damage, and all of them struggled with opiate dependencies that required long-term medical supervision. Charles never fully recovered his memories of the years before his enrollment at St. Augustine, and he retained the personality changes that had made him compliant with, rather than critical of, his family's business interests. 23 bodies were exhumed from unmarked graves on the seminary property, confirming that Father Sterling's operation had indeed been systematically murdering students who proved too difficult to control or who knew too much. The victims included sons from some of Virginia's most prominent families, young men whose deaths had been explained to their parents as the result of spiritual exhaustion, consumption, or other natural causes. Father Sterling himself vanished during the raid on St. Augustine Seminary. Despite extensive searches, neither he nor several of his key associates were ever located, leading to persistent speculation that they had escaped to British territory or had been extracted by their intelligence handlers. The mystery of their fate would linger for decades, fueling fears that similar operations might still be active elsewhere in the colonies. The exposure of the Virginia arrangement had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate families involved. The revelations about British intelligence operations within colonial society contributed significantly to the growing tensions between American colonists and British authorities, accelerating the political movements that would eventually lead to the War of 1812. Several of the families compromised by Sterling's operation became staunch supporters of American independence movements, seeking to prevent future foreign manipulation of their society. More immediately, the scandal prompted systematic reforms in Virginia's commercial and legal systems. New regulations were implemented to prevent the kind of systemic corruption that had enabled Sterling's operation, and oversight systems were established to monitor religious and educational institutions that received students from multiple families. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the St. Augustine Seminary scandal was its effect on how Virginia's elite families raised their children. The tragedy demonstrated that family secrets could be transformed into weapons against those who kept them, and that protecting children could sometimes require exposing the very scandals parents sought so desperately to hide. Thomas Jefferson Randolph never fully recovered from the experience of discovering that his family's commercial success was built upon systematic criminal activity, and that his brother had nearly been sacrificed to protect those crimes. Though Charles survived his imprisonment, the relationship between the brothers was forever changed by the knowledge of what their family had been willing to do to maintain its social position. The ruins of St. Augustine Seminary stood empty for nearly 50 years after the scandal, with local residents reporting strange sounds and unexplained lights emanating from the abandoned buildings. When the property was finally purchased for development in 1847, workers discovered additional underground chambers that had been missed during the original investigation, along with documents suggesting that operation had been even larger and more systematic than anyone had previously understood. This Mystery shows us how the relentless pursuit of social respectability and financial success can corrupt even the most fundamental bonds of family loyalty and religious faith. When families become willing to sacrifice their own children to protect their secrets, they create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who understand that desperation makes people capable of almost anything. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Sterling family's operation? Or might there be other secrets still hidden in Virginia's hills? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories from history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves a deep mystery. The darkness of human greed runs deeper than most people realize, and only the bravest souls dare to explore its depths. We will see you in the next video, where we will uncover another tale that demonstrates how far people will go when money and reputation are on the line.